As I said in my opening remarks, the global trade investment environment, at least our perception of it, seems to have changed quite dramatically in a short space of time. It wasn't that long ago where we were talking about the benefits of globalization, and now we're talking about friendshoring. That environment is clearly shifting in Asia as well. So it's terrific that we have Albert Park with us today, the Asian Development Bank's chief economist, to take us through developments in the region and to highlight what this means for Australia. Albert will come up to the lectern in a moment and speak, and then he'll be joined on the stage by two panelists to talk about some of the issues that he's raised. We have with us today Helen Stylianou, the Trade Resilience and Indo-Pacific from the Trade Resilience and Indo-Pacific Economic Cooperation Division, and also the Ambassador for Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and also Richard Yetsenga, the Chief Economist from the ANZ Bank. That panel will be moderated by Swati Pandey from Bloomberg. But first, I'd like to invite Albert to the podium to deliver his address.
Good morning. It's a real great pleasure to be here, and I've learned a lot already from participating this morning. Both India and Indonesia are two of the countries where ADB does more of its activities than in other places. At ADB, we have a large group of economists, both in the country missions in different countries and then also in our headquarters in Manila, that really monitor macroeconomic conditions throughout the region, as well as changes in the global environment and how it impacts, and also what governments are doing in terms of policy stances. And we bring that all together in trying to understand the outlook. And I'm going to talk about, draw from our most recent release of our outlook, which was a couple of weeks ago, where we updated growth and inflation forecasts for every country in the region. And it's going to be about developing Asia, which includes 46 economies, which is pretty much any economy you can think of, with the exception of Japan, which is not a developing member country of ADB. But it does include Central West Asia, as well as South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, and the Pacific. And I'll also add a little bit more content on China and the Pacific, since I think there's interest in those regions in particular. So just to deliver the key messages first, developing Asia's growth remains resilient, supported by healthy domestic demand, rebounding tourism, strong remittances, improving financial conditions, and China's reopening, leaving the zero COVID policy behind. However, there has been weak external demand from advanced countries, which has reduced demand for exports. And there have been a lot of concerns recently about the property market in China, which weigh on the outlook. Our headline numbers are that we're slightly revising down our forecast for growth in the region from 4.8% to 4.7% this year, and maintaining our forecast at 4.8% in 2024, which means that Asia will still by far be the most dynamic growth region in the world. Inflation is projected to decline from 4.4% last year to 3.6% this year and 3.5% next year, returning to pre-pandemic levels as some of the energy and food price pressures moderate. These numbers are a bit higher if you exclude China, and there are some food security concerns, but overall we still expect inflation to moderate, which is very important for providing central banks and governments a bit more space to address medium and long-term challenges. Risks have intensified with weaknesses in the PRC's property sector, and financial stability concerns remain elevated with higher interest rates, higher debt levels, et cetera. So this figure highlights what happened in the first half of this year compared to the second half of last year. And the punchline here is the very first two bars on the left, which shows that growth in developing Asia actually jumped up from 3.9% in the second half of last year to 5.1% in the first half of this year. This importantly was driven by China's reopening. So if you look at the numbers for the PRC, increased from 3.4% to 5.5%. China accounts for about half of GDP in the region, so that drove a lot of the increase, but other countries as well. In particular, India also contributed, which is the second largest economy in the region. Now, if you look at the high-tech exporters, Hong Kong, Republic of Korea, Singapore, Taipei, China, you see a lot of larger negative blue bars, and so growth has gone down because of declining exports. So the blue is the net exports. The dark blue is consumption, and that has actually been the main source of the growth and the increase in growth from the second half of last year to this year. And on the right-hand side, we also see growth in the big ASEAN countries slowing a bit. The momentum from recovery from pandemic has slowed, and they're also facing, again, the same export headwinds as many countries in the region. If we look at industrial production, we see a pretty mixed picture across the region. Some countries, if you look at the left-hand side, which presents industrial production index, like the Philippines and India, they've been growing pretty robustly for the last couple of years. But then, look at the bottom of the figure, and you can see struggling countries, Taipei, China, Pakistan, Korea, Singapore, some of these high-tech exporters. What's promising is that if you just eyeball that figure, it kind of looks like things are bottoming them out a bit, and we're seeing some upward turns in these curves. In particular, Vietnam is now coming back into positive territory. The right-hand side figure presents the PMI indices for manufacturing for many of the important economies in the region. And again, you see this mixed performance where at the top, the green areas are basically expansion, the red areas are contraction. And India and Indonesia have been robustly growing in manufacturing throughout the year. This is just monthly numbers for 2023. And at the bottom of the chart, you see these struggling high-tech exporters, Korea, Malaysia, Taipei, China, which have been negative, contracting throughout the year. And then some countries kind of in the middle, where some were doing well and have dropped off a bit, Philippines and Thailand, but then encouragingly, Vietnam and China have now creeped into positive territory in the August data. If we look at services, it's more robustly positive. Where we have data, India and China, for instance, have had very strong growth in services this year. And in general, throughout the region, services has really been an important source of growth in the region. Tourism has been recovering. So in the left-hand figure, we compare tourism relative to the pre-pandemic baselines. And you can see by the end of last year, the blue bars, tourism had come back to about 50% of pre-pandemic levels. But through 3 quarters this year, it's now up to 70%. Some economies like Armenia, Maldives, Fiji have surpassed pre-pandemic levels. A lot of the Southeast Asian countries have lagged a little bit behind, mainly because they rely more on tourists from China, which have not really come back as strongly as tourists from other source countries. Chinese tourists are back to about 40% of their pre-pandemic levels. The right-hand side shows some data on remittances. The left panel here looks at countries that export a lot of labor, and you can see that they still remain, most of them, at levels which are positive and higher than pre-pandemic. In particular, from the Pacific, Fiji and Samoa are the highest lines here, with the increased labor mobility to Australia and New Zealand. That has really bolstered remittances back to the Pacific. And on the right-hand side, we highlight what's happening in Caucasus and Central Asia, which kind of unexpectedly actually benefited from the war in Ukraine last year in terms of growth because of trade diversion through these regions and movement of Russian money and people into neighboring countries. And we see that although there's been a recent decline, still remittances or financial flows into these countries remains well above pre-pandemic levels. So this movement of Russian money and people out is more persistent than we originally had expected. I added this slide, which shows the work visa approvals for Pacific workers. into Australia and New Zealand. I just want to point out that, the last few years since the pandemic, there's been a really big increase in the work visa approvals. I was in the Pacific a couple of weeks ago, and there's a lot of talk about labor mobility and labor scarcity, actually, in some of these economies and how to address it. But of course, labor mobility, I think, is a really positive thing. It creates a lot of economic opportunities for both the economies and families in the Pacific. In the first half of 2023, work approvals were already more than all of last year in 2022 in Australia. So if we look at global economic conditions in advanced economies, we've been slightly upgrading our growth expectations for the major advanced economies, mainly US and Japan, but slightly downgrading our expectations for next year. Commodity prices have been really important in driving many aspects of government policy in the region, and the right-hand side presents some of the key ones. The blue line is crude oil, and you can see it's spiked up a bit recently, but overall it's been moderating, and we are expecting oil prices to be average $83 this year and $86 next year. What is most concerning is this black line, where we see a spike in the rice price to 15-year highs, and that really was driven by poor monsoon rains in India, which led the Indian government to impose export restrictions on rice. India accounts for 40% of the global rice market, and so this has really caused prices to spike upwards. And with El Nino coming this year and expectations that yields may be low, not just in India, but in Southeast Asia, it's raising food security concerns, especially if other countries start imposing export restrictions to deal with a high international rice price. So these are our growth forecasts, our updated growth forecasts. And the left-hand side figures and the very left-hand side bars show that growth is returning to pre-pandemic levels, although not quite there yet. And it's been a challenging, of course, external environment. If you look at subregions, it's really also true that in most regions, we're seeing growth rates returning back to pre-pandemic levels, closer to them. East Asia is lagging behind, mainly because of the slow growth in China. Caucasus and Central Asia is a bit above pre-pandemic levels because of unexpected impacts of the war in Ukraine. If you look at the right-hand side chart, it presents all of the detailed numbers for regions and major economies. And I just wanted to highlight a couple. One is China, of course, where we're downgrading our forecast slightly from 5% to 4.9% this year, and then keeping our forecast of 4.5% next year. The IMF just 2 days ago released its updated forecasts, which of course contain more data than ours because it's just been released. And their growth forecasts for China are 5% this year and 4.2% next year. The World Bank also recently released estimates, 5.1% this year, 4.4% next year. So it's really in the similar ballpark for China. The highest growing region is South Asia, driven by India's high growth. We're expecting 6.3% this year, 6.7% next year. And as was discussed, India has shown very healthy consumption, investor confidence, a very pro-growth stance of the government in terms of infrastructure investment, fiscal policies that have supported more spending by households. As you know, I was amazed at the description of Indonesia and India. They seem quite similar, like large economies, young populations, growing fast, and important markets to pay attention to. Southeast Asia, the two economies that have the highest growth forecast for us going forward are Philippines and Vietnam. In our session we did in Melbourne, people felt Vietnam had the most potential of all countries for Australian trade and investment, which I thought was interesting. It does reflect the higher growth rates and higher investment FDI that Vietnam has been receiving recently. Okay, let me push on. I want to say a few more words about China. One way in which China's slowdown affects the rest of Asia is less import demand, and we actually saw Chinese imports decline by 7.6% in the first 7 months of this year. And if you look on the left-hand side, the main category of this reduction was in machinery and electrical equipment, which accounts for about a third of Chinese imports, which is this pie graph. And among that third, if you look at the country breakdown and where that's coming from, about half of it is coming from other countries in Asia, in particular these high-tech exporters, Taipei, China, Korea, Japan, Malaysia. Now, the other issue in China that's making people lose a lot of sleep is the property sector. And we've done some analysis which suggests the linkages between the property sector and global import demand is weaker than, let's say, for machinery and electrical equipment. But what you see on the left-hand side is all of the indicators are negative. So real estate investment, importantly, has been on average about negative 10% or 8% this year in China. And property sales, forced place, land sales, and on the right-hand side, even prices have gone negative in terms of the changes year on year. The price reductions are mainly in the second and third tier cities. They've held much more steady in the large Chinese cities. And, you know, all of these issues with the property sector reflect a restructuring issue that China has has been addressing for several years now, where the property sector was overdeveloped. Local governments depended on land for revenue. They overinvested in real estate investment, oversupply of housing, over leverage. And I think the government has recognized it as a priority to deleverage the sector. And so even when they've been hit with economic challenges like the pandemic and other factors that slow growth, they've been very reluctant to put poor money back into the housing sector through the financial system, which also has made them a bit hesitant to make monetary policy too expansive. But I think there's some evidence that this is starting to recover. The August numbers were a lot better than the July numbers. The July numbers on China came out and led to a lot of stories about the doomsday scenarios for the Chinese economy, repeating kind of Japanese style recession, lost decade of growth in the 1990s. But for a lot of reasons, I don't think that's the right way to look at China. And you can see from the growth projections we have for this year and next year, we expect China to continue to grow at moderate high rates, but much lower rates than in the past. So here's just a plot of China's real GDP per capita. And you can see even the performance this year and projected next year are kind of on trend, right? We've just been seeing a gradual slowdown of growth in the Chinese economy. This happens when countries get richer. It also is a reflection of some structural factors about aging and productivity issues. And so even at these lower growth rates, the Chinese growth, because it's such a big base, will account for most of the growth in the region and a big chunk of global growth. Okay, a couple of words about inflation. So we divided inflation on the left-hand side between the excluding China and then China's numbers in the middle. And you can see that inflation is moderating, especially the energy-related, which are the gray bars, and the food-related, which are the darker orange bars. But what's encouraging is that even the core inflation is also coming down, but still in some countries above target levels. On the right-hand side figure, we show our forecasts, which are that growth will moderate in all of the regions in sub-regions in Asia, although, again, at different price levels based on different price pressures and policy choices of countries in the region. Okay, last thing I want to address is about regional economic integration. Asian Development Bank has consistently supported promoting greater regional economic integration in order to improve growth opportunities, especially for the poorest economies in the region. And we undertook an exercise to try to quantify the extent of regional integration using a variety of measures in different domains. And this figure presents those results for 2006 and 2022, and they showed deepening regional economic integration. And I think one slight optimistic counterpoint to the global narratives of deglobalization and fragmentation is that within Asia, integration is continuing to deepen. Most of the leaders in the region take a very pragmatic attitude and support open multilateral trade and investment. And we have the RCEP agreement, which provides an institutional foundation to build increased integration upon. And there's a lot of opportunities, I think, looking forward that will come from that agreement. The other point I wanted to make here, and I can elaborate more maybe in the Q&A, is China is still an important part of these value chains, if anything, even more. And, you know, despite the kind of more international political discussion of China, you know, not engaging or creating certain tensions with other countries in ASEAN, on the economic side, China is still a very attractive partner because it is so efficient, has such efficient supply chains in so many sectors, and can really bring valuable know-how and help support value chains that are very globally competitive. So this creates a very strong attraction, I think. Okay. So let me conclude with this slide on some of the risks to the outlook. China's still somewhat fragile recovery, potentially could hold back growth. We have issues of financial stability risk. A few countries in the region have debt sustainability issues, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Laos, and many countries have higher debt levels that they're still struggling to address in terms of freeing up fiscal space to address longer-term challenges. Food security is emerging as a risk. And I wanted to point out that even in the longer term, if we have a transition to net zero at the scale that we need, it will involve a different kind of agriculture, and it'll involve much less land in cropping, and it should result in even higher food prices and energy prices, and that will become a challenge in terms of protecting vulnerable groups. And finally, there are other risks. U.S. Fed interest rate policy has a very outsized influence on financial flows in the region. And of course, there's the geopolitics and that have been discussed quite a lot this morning that could have many implications for trade and investment. And let me stop there. And thank you for your attention.
Sorry, Julie, I think it went. Can you set this up again, please? We are running a quiz on this one, a poll. I think there should be QR codes on your seats. If you scan the QR code, there should be a question. And we will have the results soon on that. Also, we are taking questions throughout the session. So please feel free to send your questions in and we will take it. Thank you. Okay, so that's a question. Which country in the region?
I think I previewed this one.
Had the biggest opportunity for Australian businesses?
Obviously influenced by the morning discussion.
I'd like to start with you, Helen. So Southeast Asia is a big priority for Australia. And we have seen that in the Southeast Asia priority for 2040 as well. How do you think Australia can diversify and where are the opportunities?
Thank you very much. So I think in the Southeast Asia economic strategy, what it recognised is there's quite a strong institutional framework for our trade with Southeast Asia. There's a large network of FTAs, including RCEP, as Albert mentioned. There's the CPTPP. There's also ANSFTA. And that, as well as a range of bilateral agreements, and that provides a good institutional base. But I think, as the economic report also points out, investment is underdone overall. I think what we can do is to think a little bit differently about how we negotiate trade agreements and the issues we address in trade agreements to address some of the things that are underdone, and to look at some of the new challenges. So, for example, focusing on rules and standards and infrastructure needed to facilitate investment, needed to facilitate the energy transition, and needed to basically attract some of the investment that we think is required for Southeast Asia's development. One of the negotiations that I'm working on does exactly that, actually. It's called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and it has 4 pillars. So it's quite different to your traditional FTA. It has a trade pillar, which looks a bit like a traditional FTA, but it also has pillars dealing with some of the contemporary challenges, like supply chain resilience, an agreement on a clean economy, so to facilitate the transition, and also one on the fair economy, dealing with things like tax and anti-corruption settings to help the region move forward in terms of the settings that will attract investment. It also deals with things like good regulatory practices and services domestic regulation. So as part of what we can do in that context, we can of course provide technical assistance and capacity building to Southeast Asia to meet the standards set by the agreement to attract investment, and to crowd in private sector investment. In the Southeast Asia economic strategy, we looked at the deal teams that Penny talked about earlier. So bringing in government, private sector and institutional investors like Export Finance Australia, for example, to facilitate deals that might not otherwise happen. So I think there's some of the things that we could do.
Richard, I'll come to you next. So Southeast Asia is, as Albert pointed out in his presentation, has been growing well and is expected to show strong economic growth as well. What are the primary areas of focus, according to you, for Australia to invest and stimulate its trade relationships?
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you to the Asia Society both for having me and for hosting this event. Australia's past prosperity is very much dependent on the region, and the future looks no different, even if it's slightly different. And on that question, I think if we look backwards at Southeast Asia and even South Asia, the countries that really went to the world with a very clear strategy did very well. The Singapore services opportunity, Singapore pharmaceuticals, Singapore financial services, very clear strategies, very substantial rewards. Vietnam's been spoken about. Vietnam with a very deliberate foreign direct investment driven kind of manufacturing effort, a whole of government effort that was very clear, very professionally done, very well done. But if you kind of opened the door and said, hey, business and capital, come to us, but we won't do anything in particularly special for you, what happened is they went to China in reality. And I think the single biggest shift, the single biggest issue that's put kind of kinetic energy into the ASEAN story, into the Southeast Asia story, into the South Asia story has been the shift in China. It's a different economic proposition. It's no longer the automatic magnet for foreign direct investment, for expats, for portfolio capital, for credit investors. It's still, as Albert said, half of the region, but growing more slowly, much more slowly, I would say. And I think that's very structural and embedded and reflects a range of long-lived reasons. And that, I think, means China's not the capital vacuum cleaner for the region. And it really provides this opportunity for the rest. So I just try and encourage business to say, whatever your view about an economy in the region was before, you need to reassess that today against particularly what's happening in that economy. And India is a great story where there is actually a really serious track record of reform, but also, businesses are already looking elsewhere apart from the North Asia magnet.
Right. And Albert, you spoke about the regional growth and the global story. But for Australia, where do you see opportunities for us to strengthen our trade and investment relationships?
Well, I think this session was designed correctly to answer that question with a focus on Indonesia and India, because I think Southeast Asia and South Asia, especially India, are really where growth momentum is shifting. So one interesting thing about, China's slowdown is that we observed last year that it was the first year that China's growth rate was lower than average growth rate for Asia. And it means that before, China was always pulling up the growth rates, and now it's not. And the growth momentum is shifting to these other dynamic regions. And so for, I think, trade and investment, growth is really important because growth reflects new opportunities in these markets and growing middle classes, mature economies that have high incomes but are not growing fast. Usually they're very, very competitive markets. It's often hard to get in. But in dynamic economies, new demand is coming on all the time. And if you can see those niches, and be forward looking, that's where, lots of profit, I think, often can be made. So those are important. Broadly, I think, some of the big growth trends in the region, and not just in the region, really globally, but especially in the region, one is digital services trade, right, which is the fastest growing part of the global economy. And, I think needs to be promoted through harmonizing standards and regulations, that was just discussed, but also seeking these opportunities because, digitalization was kind of accelerated during the pandemic, and there's lots of opportunities right now to think about how this new technology can provide opportunities for trading services, especially in English-speaking countries where we know business process outsourcing has become a really big business, like in India and in the Philippines. I even said in the Pacific, when I realized everyone was talking in English, that you should be thinking about how you can get into these opportunities. And the other big one is we've been talking about all day is the green transition, which, is going to accelerate, and the amount of investment and business that it's going to create. I mean, I've been amazed. ADB now is focusing almost all of its activity on climate change. We're going to be increasing our lending substantially after a capital adequacy framework review by like 40%, up to 40%. And a lot of it is really trying to help private sector businesses make these large renewable investments and adaptation investments that'll support the green transition in countries throughout the region. So I view that also as a huge business opportunity. And in Asia, of course, China is leading. They made early bets on these sectors and they're paying off big time. But Indonesia is leading, I think, in thinking really strongly. Many countries in the region are introducing carbon pricing schemes, which is going to create even more demand for thinking about how can we reduce carbon emissions of our industries, especially heavy industry. So I think this is where change is kind of happening.
Thanks, Albert. We'll come to a green transition in a bit. We have the results of the poll, and India is leading with 38%. So I have results from last year. So India has gone up from 21% to 22%, and China was at 34% last year. Oh, it's moving still. Should I not? Okay, I should wait. Okay, so my next question is to you, Helen. You've spoken about diversification. Can you tell us how successful Australian businesses have been in the past, I think, 3 or 4 years that we began the whole diversification away from China? And also, where does this leave Australia's economic relationship with China?
Thank you very much. Look, I'd like to respond to that by starting by saying trade diversification isn't a new thing, actually. Australia's trade policy has for decades been focused on a multilateral setting because the multilateral setting offers the best opportunity for diversification of trade. It gives the greatest number of options to businesses to trade into different markets by negotiating with a large number of countries at the same time. That's why we've prioritised negotiations in the WTO for a long time, and then why we sought to go down the path of negotiating FTAs, because we wanted to go deeper and to extend our relationships and the opportunities in new sectors, for example, the digital sector, through FTAs where there wasn't a multilateral opportunity to have that conversation. So diversification itself is not a new thing. What I think has been, and maybe to say that open markets provide, or they're key to economic resilience, I think that's really an important point. And trade diversification is about ensuring that we have economic resilience and trade resilience. What is new and is different is that COVID, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and some Chinese measures on particular Australian products in recent years really brought into stark relief the importance of those rules and those open markets. So they made it clear, for example, in relation to Australian barley, the ability to rely on a CPTPP outcome into Mexico meant that Australian producers of barley had an alternative to resort to. So I think that's the focus of diversification, is giving the most options to business. And that allows them to make the calculation in terms of the risks and benefits, certainty, price. What do they prioritise at any particular moment? And that's why we keep negotiating FTAs and why we've evolved in the types of rules and standards that we negotiate. But it's why we're looking at a second FTA with India, for example, why we're pursuing one with the European Union, a very big market for us that we don't have that kind of preferential access with. And it's why we keep working in institutions like APEC, which are non-binding, to keep the conversation going about standards and cooperation, which will provide more opportunities for our businesses into Southeast Asia, for example. But also picking up on an earlier conversation, part of the trade diversification conversation right now is about diversifying what we trade. So in the critical minerals space, we're obviously a supplier of raw critical minerals, but we want to, in order to create resilient supply chains and to take advantage of an opportunity that comes with the energy transition, we want to change the type of critical minerals that we trade in to move into a processed sector. So that requires a whole new way of thinking about trade in that space. So I think that's what I'd say about diversification.
And Richard, how should Australian businesses think about trading with China in an era where the world is kind of like moving away? We are talking about de-risking, talking about decoupling. What does that mean for Australian businesses?
I don't know that should businesses have ever seen the environment as risk-free? That would be surprising to me. I mean, we use these words, but in reality, look, I think with China, there's only engagement. I mean, this is an $18 trillion economy. It's 20% of world GDP. It's more than 3 times larger than Japan. It's more than 4 times larger than India. It's the world's largest trading nation. I mean, how can you possibly decouple from China? You can't. I think the issue is you've had to engage, but in a way that suited the times. And I think the times are different. I think that's absolutely accurate. When China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, I think there was a real opportunity to recognize something fundamentally had shifted here. And world trading patterns would never be the same. World investment patterns would never be the same. The movement of people would be affected for decades to come. And I think having a really aspirational mindset and doing your best to gloss over some of the challenges of the Chinese market were the ways you had to operate. Now, I don't think you can gloss over the challenges because actually the returns are more sober and the global trading environment is very, very different. But I think engagement is the only choice, just choosing the engagement for the time. Right. And Albert, sticking to the same topic about de-risking and supply chains, China is also doing its own decoupling in terms of its supply chains, right? What effects are you seeing in this region, and what is happening in supply chains? And should we worry about fragmentation of the global economy?
Yeah, there's been so much discussion about these words: de-risking, decoupling, fragmentation. So we try to look at the evidence and see what's actually happened. One thing we know is there's been a very sharp decline of foreign direct investment into China, dating back to last year and continuing into this year. And in particular, in strategic sectors like semiconductors, telecom, 5G technologies, et cetera. But if we look at trade data, it looks very different. So we don't really see such strong evidence of decoupling. We see regional economic integration deepening, as the point I made. We're staying very connected, and China staying a big part of them. In fact, there was an interesting paper, published by the Peterson Institute in DC, where they show that even the IPEF countries that are the ones that the U.S. is trying to reach out to, their trade in terms of the imports and exports with China are at all-time highs, or much higher than 5 years ago. And if you look at China's share of intermediate goods trade in the region, which is kind of an indicator of supply chain activity, those are still pretty high, like 30–40% of Chinese intermediate goods exports are going to other parts of the region, and similar percentage of intermediate goods imports are coming from the region. So yeah, it's reinforcing this point that it's you have to stay engaged to China, and they're competitive in a lot of the emerging sectors, right? So in especially in renewable energy and in some of the high-tech fields, where they're competing very strongly, with other countries globally. Oh yeah, the other thing I wanted to say here is that there have been some economic studies which have tried to simulate or look at scenarios of decoupling and who would gain and who would lose. And most of those studies find that it's actually not China or the US that are hurt the most by forcing countries to pick sides into one camp or the other. It's actually the smaller countries that are trading both with China and the US. And especially in Southeast Asia, where you have a lot of economies exporting a lot to the US, but still sourcing a lot of inputs from China. If you told them you got to pick, number one, they're going to resist because it's not in their interests. It'll be strongly against their interests to agree to that. But also, if you force them to choose, you're going to really harm their economies. And I'm not sure if that's what you really want to do when your target is, let's say, China.
Right. Going to the green transition theme that Albert alluded to earlier. So, Richard, I'll start with you. So we hear a lot about sustainability, green transition. How can Australia leverage its trade and investment relationships in Asia to accelerate this economic transformation to clean energy?
Yeah, I think Australia's always leveraged our relationships around any stage of economic development. We've always tapped offshore capital, offshore expertise, offshore labour, offshore customers. It's part of the reason we've got one of the highest trade to GDP ratios in the advanced economies. And certainly when you think about the climate transition, the relationships Australia has, the more slowly growing but wealthy North Asian economies in Korea and Japan, for instance, strong sources of capital, strong sources of technology, potentially customers, but faster growing parts of Southeast Asia that have probably got a longer and more elongated transitions, substantial source of customers, I think, as well as the labour Australia will need to generate its own transition. But I think very much on this one, rather than starting with the outside in, I think Australia needs to start with the inside in. There's a huge policy challenge here to get the transition right. And that's got to be the policy focus today, I think, in this particular space. I mean, Australia's very lucky in one regard here. It's perhaps the economy in the world that's benefited most from the brown economy and actually has a right to win in the green economy as well. I can't think of another country that's been endowed with the natural resources Australia has had that straddle both worlds. But to shift from the brown to the green, we need to transition across a whole range of parts of the economy, the skills we require, the way the taxation system works, the way investment's occurring in an economy where skilled labour is already hard to find, where interest rates are substantially higher, and obviously the global trading environment is more difficult. So I think we'll find actually those offshore springboards come from success with domestic policy settings, and we've got to stay the course on that.
Helen, we have strong trade relations with Korea and Japan, and that is based off energy. In this world where we are transitioning, in what areas can these bilateral relationships with Japan and Korea further assist Australia in its goals towards decarbonization?
Yeah, I think the first thing that I would say is that our relationships with Korea and Japan are multifaceted, multidimensional, and they're deep. Energy has been and will continue to be a cornerstone of the trade and investment relationship. But the relationship, energy security equals economic security, which equals national security for these partners. And we are an important partner for them now and into the future. I'd really like to back in what Richard has said there, that both of these countries will be important partners for us in our transition, in our domestic transition, in building what we need in terms of our own economy to make that transition, but also to be a supplier to them of clean energy and to our region. And that is our intention, to continue to be a reliable and stable supplier of energy to our region, as we have been for decades, based on investment from those countries in part. And that's how we would like to take it forward going into the future. I think things like hydrogen, green steel and iron, for example, we will require support and investment from Japan and Korea for our own decarbonisation, and then to transform to be a global supplier of clean energy.
Right. I'll be taking a couple of questions from the floor. So we have got a few. I think this one, if we can go to the poll results page. This question, maybe Albert, you can take. Given Japan has invested over $120 billion into Australia over 60 years and the second largest export market for Australia, and given Quad, why do you think the poll shows such low ranking for Japan in terms of the size of opportunity? It's 2%.
Well, I'm not really an expert on the Japan economy or the Australian economy, but I think part of it may be what I said before, that it's as a mature economy, it's not growing as much in a lot of the spaces, very competitive. And Japan is on many metrics, in terms of product sophistication, et cetera, one of the most advanced countries in the world, maybe the most advanced country in the world. So, fitting, and whenever countries are trading, you're trying to figure out what can you supply them and what can they supply you. And once that's realized, then to grow that really requires developing new skills or new products that can get more market share. And so things like working together on renewable energy and whatnot could maybe get you in that direction. And Japan, of course, also is seeing all of the opportunities in the rest of the world and countries that have very complementary kind of endowments and products to trade with. They're a big presence, and I think a supporter of growth through their investment in trade and, really throughout the region, and especially in Southeast Asia, where they've been very engaged in some of the more dynamic economies, especially a place like Thailand, where they've developed auto supply chains, et cetera.
Right. And Helen, maybe this one's for you. With CPTPP, RCEP, and now IPEF, at what point are there too many multilateral processes in the region, representing a challenge for businesses to understand and take advantage of these agreements?
Never.
Spaghetti bowl.
Yeah, I think, look, I mean, that is a real problem in terms of understanding which is the best tariff to take advantage of. But as I mentioned, in relation to IPEF, it's quite a different exercise to CPTPP or RCEP for that matter. It doesn't have market access. So what that is really about is about building institutional capacity in the Indo-Pacific region, in countries that are not necessarily part of all of those agreements. So, for example, Indonesia is not part of CPTPP. India is not part of CPTPP. Fiji is not part of CPTPP or RCEP for that matter. So it's a different focus. And what we're seeing in IPEF as compared with some of those others is taking forward very contemporary problems. Supply chain resilience, for example, it sets up a crisis response network, which is a very practical, tangible thing that will help countries in our region respond in the case of a crisis, have contact points to go to, identify a list of critical sectors and goods that they need cooperation on under the crisis supply network. So never.
Richard, this is for you. When you tell business to reassess South and Southeast Asia as a destination for investment, why do you think they haven't done so already?
I think part of it, I suspect, is inertia, and part of it is that China has been a market which has taken substantial investment. But even if you put aside the global issues, which may or may not change, who knows, for instance, who'll be in the White House in the US in 18 months. It might be a different environment. But domestically, I think China is different. Just mathematically, you can't become the world's largest economy through exports. Who are you going to trade with? China is transitioning to domestic demand. It's not a policy choice. I think it's not a bug. It's a feature of economic development for a very large economy. The Korea model is not an option for China. You can't become a first world economy through exports with a population of 1.3 billion. You must be domestically driven. So businesses already will be seeing that transition. And I think part of it is, I think, a lack of recognition about how important this China story has been to making it more complex for the rest of the region. And as China has become kind of a less aspirational investment, foreign direct investment, talent story, I think you will see over time more businesses shift to the region. And look, I would call out India as well. I mean, it has, the wisdom of crowds, 39% say it's the next place. Look, I think that's right. If you think about services, manufacturing and customers, India is the only country there that offers you all three. Vietnam is a fantastic story, absolutely no doubt, as a manufacturing and export destination. But India gives you the triple treat.
And one final question. I'm not addressing it to either of you. You can, maybe all three of you can answer, or just one. It's a difficult one. What contingencies are foreign companies making in the event of a US-China conflict? Most businesses made little preparations prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Helen?
You're talking about like a military conflict, I guess, in some kind of Taiwan scenario.
Yeah,
Lucky they asked economists, but anyway.
Right, yeah. Well, I can say the US-China conflict would be much more disruptive than a Russian invasion of Ukraine to the global economy, even if it was limited, in a smaller sphere around Taiwan. It would lead to a kind of mammoth kind of accelerated decoupling, let's put it that way, and sanctions going back. I think it was something we should all really try hard to avoid. And I'm not ADB tries to stay out of politics, but we hope politicians will at least understand the economic costs of such an event.
Would you like to add anything?
I'm very comfortable, thank you.
That was quite insightful. We heard from our panelists that digitization and green transition are big areas of focus, and that we should avoid a US-China conflict. Thank you so much. Thanks for your time.